I just want to welcome everybody today. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Tom Reichert. Very humbled and honored to be the dean here at the University of South Carolina in our College of Information and Communications. This is our first conversation this summer. It's our opportunity to host some founders, some thought leaders, some truly remarkable people who can share their perspective on some of the challenges and opportunities facing our society when it comes to getting information to citizens so they can make good decisions for themselves and for their communities. We're very excited today to host Stephen Brill. As I was mentioning earlier, I'm always going to be indebted to Mr. Brill. He published one of my research reports when I was assistant professor in Brill's content. And last year I was leafing through my ALA magazine, and I was surprised to see that Richland Library, run by one of our nationally recognized alums, Melanie Huggins, was an early adopter of NewsGuard, a company founded by Mr. Brill. So I'm going to turn it over to Randy Covington, our Director of Special Projects. He'll be asking some questions, but we highly encourage you to listen closely and ask your own questions as well. So Randy, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I was very excited about this first in the series of conversations because in my world of media ethics and so forth, the things that we worry about are the things that you're trying to address. So Steve Brill, I'm not a fan of long introductions, but there actually are a few things that probably should be said. Founder of Court TV, founder of the American Lawyer magazine, founder of Brill's Content, as Tom mentioned, winner of multiple national magazine awards. His special report for Time magazine on the high cost of medical care was a seminal look at this that was turned into a book. As you may know, newspapers now charge us for online content. And Steve Brill and his partner, Gordon Kravitz, are basically the people that came up with the system that most newspapers in the US use to do that. And now with Gordon Kravitz, founder, co-CEO of something called NewsGuard. It's an internet browser extension that rates thousands of websites for trust and credibility. Here in Columbia, the Richland Library is one of the NewsGuard subscribers. In prepping for my mission today, I read Steve's book, Tailspin, and reading from the cover, the people and forces behind America's 50-year fall. So, Steve, we're at a time where people in the US have more access to more news and information than they ever have, yet a substantial portion of the population refuses to accept things that are demonstrably true. And all of this is just seemingly tearing our country apart. So it's a big question, and I don't expect you to summarize your entire book, but what are some of your insights of the forces that are in play here?
Well, the book was really about how basic American values and strengths had been really turned on their head to cause the decline of the United States since the 1970s. And when I say decline, what I mean are things like our healthcare system, our healthcare results, our education results. We spend more per capita on in K-12 education than any country in the world by far, and we rank like number 32 when it comes to, the literacy or the math skills of our children. I'm talking about income inequality, the rates of child poverty, the casino economy that we created, whereby some people do very well, but they do very well by not keeping faith with the interests of their stakeholders, their employees, even their customers. And just to give you one example, the First Amendment, which we cherish, and which is especially cherished at a school like this, was turned on its head by a piece of litigation brought by, of all people, Ralph Nader, the consumer crusader. Back in, I think it was 1975 or 76, Nader brought a lawsuit on behalf of a drugstore in Richmond, Virginia. The drugstore wanted to advertise its prices because it had low prices. And there was a law that had been passed in Virginia at the behest of the large drugstore chains that said you couldn't advertise your drug prices because they wanted to be protected. So, so far so good. Probably everyone who's here today would say, well, that's a lawsuit that ought to succeed. And it did succeed. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that corporations had free speech rights too. And in this case, the free speech would be to advertise drug prices that would enable people who need prescription drugs to get them at lower prices. What could be bad about that? Well, that morphed over the years as a result of some very smart legal work by very talented lawyers into a corporate free speech doctrine that became Citizens United, and allows corporations to donate as much money as they want to political campaigns. And that's caused a lot of our problems in Washington and in state capitals around the country. I mean, that's one example of a great American value, the First Amendment, being turned on its head by very smart people. So the book is all about examples of that. And one of the other examples is information technology. In the 1970s, the great advance in technology, the television set and broadcast television, brought us all together, as a country. We shared the same set of facts. We all watched the moon landing together, for those of you who were old enough at the time. We watched the Kennedy assassination events together. Everybody shared the same experience. Now advances in information technology have done exactly the opposite. They've allowed us to go off into little corners with people who agree with us and, join a Facebook group that could be an anti-vax group, just follow the people on, Twitter that you agree with, just watch the cable news channel that you agree with. And again, that's an advance in technology. It's Americans at their best in terms of inventing things, but the result is not so good. So that's what that book is about. And, part of what I realized in doing the book was, again, that people had lost the same set of facts. And the reason for that is right now, if you walked into the Richland Library, you'd see books that are arranged, by subject matter. You'd go to the bookshelf, you'd take a book off the shelf, you'd read the book jacket, you'd know who the publisher is, you'd read something about the author, and best of all, there's a librarian. And the librarian can say, well, if you're doing research on the minimum wage, you should know that this economist is very smart, very well credentialed, but he's a conservative, so he's going to present the argument probably against the minimum wage. And to get a balance, you should look at this book too, because this is a liberal economist. And that's how you can get a balance. Now imagine if instead you walked into the Richland Library and the only thing there were 2 trillion pieces of paper just flying around in the air. And you plucked one out and you start reading it. You don't know who wrote it. You don't know who's financing it. You don't know what their background is. And God knows there's no librarian. And that's the internet. That's your Facebook feed. That's your Twitter feed. That's your Google search. That's your Bing search. So NewsGuard is meant, in effect, to restore what libraries do, which is give people some basic information about who's feeding them the news, what they're about to read.
So let's, for those who are not familiar with NewsGuard, libraries, but it's also available to individuals and other organizations, and in effect, it rates or evaluates websites using multiple criteria. So I think people would be interested in knowing a little bit more about how your team at NewsGuard figures out what's credible and what isn't.
Well, it's strictly apolitical. That's for starters. And we have a balanced set of people to make sure that, but we also have a process where nothing gets rated. And when we rate something, we write a nutrition label, which is 3,000 to 4,000 words explaining exactly why we rated it the way we rated it. So we use 9 criteria, ranging from we use 9 criteria. You get 100 points. You can get 100 points, and each of the criteria has a different weight. So, for example, if you repeatedly publish false news, that counts for 22 points. If you don't do it, if you do it, you lose those 22 points. If you don't have a corrections policy, that counts for 12.5 points. If you don't disclose who owns the site, that counts. So when we add up those 9 criteria, if you get a 60 or above, you get a green. And if you get below a 60, you get a red. And you have to be really bad to get a red. And if you're wondering, well, who decides what is false news? That category, that score, that criteria is really reserved for completely bad sites, hoax sites, of which there are now, out of the 6,300 sites that we've rated, some 2,000 of them are like that. And when I say really bad, really hoax sites, what I mean is a site called naturalnews.com, which will tell you that if you have cancer, if you can buy a subscription to their apricot pits, and the apricot pits will cure your cancer, and your oncologist is just ripping you off. That's a real site. And by the way, that site has 100 times the traffic as the site of the American Cancer Society. So that's an example. Or if you say that 9/11 was an inside job, or the government is filled with pedophiles, or that that masks will kill you, or that the flu shot will give you COVID. So you have to be really bad to fail repeatedly publish as false news. The other stuff is not weighted as high, but is important. Do you responsibly separate news from opinion? So, for example, both the CNN and MSNB website get an overall green, but they fail that criteria because they don't separate news from opinion. Their news shows are just riddled with opinionated statements, from the journalists that they have.
That's one of the obvious questions. And for those of you who are listening in, there's a chat function. You access it at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you have any questions that you have as this proceeds, please type them in that chat box. All right, so this issue where we put journalists on cable news and ask them to say provocative things, and the result is that they're now commentators and not journalists. How do you weigh and balance that?
Well, that's toxic. That a related issue is journalists who tweet, and it always bothers me to read something in the New York Times, which is a careful, maybe even explosive report about something, and then the writer goes on CNN or MSNBC and says more than is in the story and expounds on it. It just, goes a little further because he doesn't have an editor sitting there with him saying, well, you can't prove that. And that's a slippery slope, as they say, which is a cliche, but in this case, it's not a cliche. And, for example, we don't let our journalists, and the ratings that I've been referring to are done by a team of 3 or 4 dozen, journalists here and in Europe. We don't let them tweet their opinions about anything. that is even remotely related to news or politics or healthcare, that's what you sign on to do when you take a job with us. You're not, that's not who you're going to be. And that would hurt our credibility, and we just won't allow it. And I think more newsrooms ought to be, stricter about that. There's an incentive that the journalists have, though, to do that, because they're increasingly being told, well, you have to create your own brand. Well, the way to create your own brand is to do good journalism, not, mouth off about the journalism you've done.
So you had a unique vantage point when you did Press Plus, this system for monetizing online traffic to newspaper websites. I remember bringing journalists from overseas to your offices. And I remember the questions they asked, and they were not that different from what I heard from journalists here in the US. There was a perception that media organizations couldn't charge for content. And it was at a time that readership was dropping, advertising was dropping, and there's more competition they'd ever seen before. If you were stepping from the business side looking at this, you have to charge for content. So
by the way, you have to charge for content, but the content has to be worth.
Thank you. Because what was happening, and has happened, as we've all witnessed, is the content has become so thin that it has very little value. So, but back to this issue of media organizations and visionary leadership. Because what I saw when we were sitting in your offices were journalists who, if they were covering the sports team, why aren't they winning? What are you going to do to fix this? They were covering a business. Your profits are down. What are you going to do? But when it came to the newsrooms, they singularly were paralyzed in dealing in a substantive way, or certainly resistant to. So as you view leadership of media organizations adapting to this new media world, what are your thoughts and insights?
Well, the first thing is whoever's leading that organization has to believe in the content, has to believe in the mission. And the mission isn't, how many car ads can I sell? Because first of all, you're increasingly not going to sell any, because Google and Facebook dominate pretty much all advertising. But the mission can be believed in because it's valuable. There's a park across the street from my apartment in Manhattan that for 2 years was being renovated. And my wife and I could not figure out why it was being renovated. It was a perfectly nice park. And, nor did we know when the renovation was going to be finished, nor did we know who was paying for it. Well, I would have paid for that information. I would have paid a little bit. It told me I've got to give you, $3 or $4 or $6 a month for really important local reports in my neighborhood in Manhattan, because the New York Times isn't going to cover that, because it's just one little park in the middle place. But local journalism especially is valuable. Knowing what happened at the local school board meeting, knowing, seeing your daughter's, picture in the paper because she hit a home run at the high school softball game, you'll pay for that. People will definitely pay for that. And somehow, in the 1990s, everybody got this idea that the internet needs to be free. Information deserves to be free. Well, the people who gather that information, if when they're checking out at the supermarket, they say to the cashier, listen, you really can't charge me because I'm providing all this good information for free, the cashier would probably have a problem with that, as would that person's landlord. So we went into this really bad place, and I think we're starting to come out of it. And the good news is that if you're good at producing that content, if you can figure out how to make it lively but important, you will find, the right job.
So we have a question from one of my colleagues from the iSchool, or the library school, Kim Thompson. I think public and even school and academic libraries are the perfect place to help the community learn these new literacy skills. Does NewsGuard provide professional training for librarians, or are there guides for the end user to help them understand your review criteria?
The answer is we do both, but also we are excessively transparent. There is more than you could possibly want to read about our review criteria right on our website. And also, whenever you're looking at a nutrition label, you get the bios of every person who worked on it so that you can see what their backgrounds are. But the answer is we have news literacy materials that we gladly make available. When we install NewsGuard for free in a public library, we provide all kinds of training to the personnel first, so that they know exactly what it's all about and what it's not about. It's not about politics at all. It's about doing what librarians do, which is not blocking anything, not attempting to censor anything, but giving people information so that they can make decisions for themselves.
Here in Columbia, our Richland Library has NewsGuard. The system has 13 libraries, and NewsGuard is on the public computers at all 13 libraries. We have one of the better libraries in the nation, and I'm pleased to see.
Oh, I understand. And the reason it's so important is, let's go back to how I introduced the subject, which is, librarians increasingly know that a large portion of their patrons every day, their visitors, are coming for broadband access. And other than standing over their shoulders saying, that's a QAnon story, you should take it with a grain of salt, they're sort of, helpless. Whereas if someone picks up a book or is checking something out, they can say something about what their choice is. So what NewsGuard is, in essence, is a substitute for the librarian looking over somebody's shoulder and saying, well, that's a conservative but highly reputable site, that's a liberal but highly reputable site, or that's a hoax site.
Well, one thing that I found interesting in going through the NewsGuard website, which is excellent and does in fact gives the scores. I was fact checking you on the numbers and you got them all right. False content 22%, something else 12.5. But on your website, you make a differentiation between what you do in NewsGuard and fact checking. It sort of sounds like the same thing, but it actually is different. Can you talk a little about that?
It's not. Well, first, the platforms, if you ever watch a congressional hearing where, the heads of, Facebook or YouTube or Twitter are testifying, it all goes exactly like this. They say, we're trying really, really hard. We know this is a really big problem, and we really, really care, and we're spending millions of dollars, and we know we have to do better. And then they say, and we have, all these, fact checkers. Now, the truth is they spend relatively nothing on fact checkers, but the fact checkers that they have maybe can check 1/100th of 1% of what's there. And by definition, fact checking is after the fact. It's after it's gone up. It's after it's been published. It's after it's gone viral. So what we do is by gauging the overall reliability of the source, we have achieved 97% penetration, which means we have rated all the news and information sites responsible for 97% of engagement on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube. And that doesn't mean we solve all the problems of the world. If the New York Times, says that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, as they did, way back when, we're not solving that problem because the New York Times is still green. But we will update, our nutrition label. We'll certainly mention it. So what we do with the fact checkers is we rely on them often. We obviously read a site, for 3 or 4 days to get a sense of it. We check, with the fact checkers to see if they've said anything about the site. And by the way, some of the fact checkers are biased themselves. But we always
we have that case right now was the coronavirus actually in a lab where the fact checkers we're calling that false, and now the president says we should investigate this. President Biden.
The fact checkers repeatedly said that was false.
Yep.
And at NewsGuard, we repeatedly said it was unsubstantiated.
Yep. Good. And to me, that's a key differentiation. We have politicians who want to pass laws to restrict fact checking because they want to argue about it. And you're sort of avoiding that argument by going to the credibility of the website as opposed to.
So what we do is we will re-report what the fact checkers have reported. We will credit them. We'll say they reported it first. We will re-report it. Unlike the fact checkers, we will call for comment, which most fact checkers don't do, which I think is a pretty big gap. If you're saying someone is publishing something false, you ought to call them for comment on the off chance that maybe you're wrong. Or you can also include their comment. The way to think about NewsGuard is to think of it as the opposite of an algorithm. Right now, there are 4 different entities that rate the overall reliability and trustworthiness of websites. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's Google. In those 3 cases, if you're the editor of the New York Times or any newspaper or website, and you call them and say, "Hey, what's my rating?" They'll say, "Well, we can't tell you." So the New York Times doesn't know if it's rated higher or lower than the Baltimore Sun, but it has a rating. You wouldn't even know whom to call. And if you got that person on the phone and they told you the rating, and then you said, "Well, why did you rate me that way?" And they'd say, "Well, we can't tell you that because you gamed the system." Then there's the 4th entity, NewsGuard. You know exactly what your rating is. You know exactly who rated you. You can. Our phone number is right there, as is our email. Our nutrition label, 4,000 words long, tells you why we rated you the way we rated you. But just in case, you can get us on the phone and we'll walk you through it. And unlike an algorithm, we want you to game the system. We want you to say, "Gee, if I had a corrections policy, I'd get a higher score from NewsGuard," which is true. And of the 6,000 plus sites we've rated, something like 900 have done something to improve their scores since we rated them. We think that's great. We like that. So that's how we're different from fact checkers, which is you'll have our red rating before you publish your next hoax. One very good example is the hoax that 5G causes COVID-19. In November and December of 2019, the sites that were saying that, and it was instigated by one site in particular because we tracked down where it started, were saying that 5G causes cancer. In February of 2020, they pivoted to 5G was causing COVID-19. Natural, a pivot. It's a smart way to get, more programmatic advertising because more people are interested in COVID than cancer at the time. They already had our red rating before they published their first hoax about, 5G and COVID-19 because they had it because they said that 5G causes cancer. And if you read our nutrition label, even before we updated it to say they were now saying 5G causes COVID, you would have read that they made up this story about 5G and cancer, and you would have taken everything they were saying with the appropriate grain of salt. So we pre-bunk, not debunk. We're there with that rating before the site does more damage. You're muted, Randy.
I was getting a little feedback, and I've been trying to remember to mute, but I also have to remember to unmute. My colleague, Eric Robinson, is listening to this. Eric is a lawyer. He teaches media law for us, does an excellent job, and he has the distinction of once working for you. So, Eric, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, I was going to, in the interest of full disclosure, I was going to mention that you won't remember, but I worked for American Lawyer when I was in law school in 90 and 91, way back when.
That was really.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm listening to you, and I've been, kind of following what you've been doing since those days, and a lot of it has to do with integrity of media, integrity of other institutions like the legal profession and courts with Court TV to some extent. And the question I have about all this is the the, me, the media writ large, and by that I include everything: internet, TV, cable, etc. The economic and other incentives are all in the other direction. Hype, not fact checking, commenting, all the stuff you've been talking about. So, and I also wonder whether users, a large number, some do, the people on this conference do care about truth and integrity, but a lot of people don't seem to care. And so I'm just wondering how you feel about that. Do you think you're a bulwark in the, a voice in the wilderness, or do you hope that there'll be some rallying to that kind of cause?
I think I would take issue with the premise of your question. I think we're increasingly seeing that really good content pays and that people care. The Economist may have the highest profit margins of any magazine/website that we know of. The New York Times is doing better than ever. Local newspapers have a harder time of it with advertising, but those that are successfully strengthening their product and charging online are doing better. So yeah, I mean, garbage often sells, but the fact is, if you look at the most profitable online news sites, they're all pretty high quality. The Daily Mail being the one exception that I can think of, but they're all pretty high quality.
But I mean, I'm talking about Reddit and Facebook and Twitter and all that other stuff that's out there.
They're obviously quite successful. Although Reddit loses money, but the others are successful. But that doesn't mean that going in the other direction can't also be successful. It's not one will trump the other. The National Enquirer was highly popular when Look magazine was popular.
Right. Okay. I'll buy that.
All right. So one more question from Eric that I hoped he would ask, and I suspect he will. Eric writes a column for the South Carolina Press Association, and he wrote a column that grabbed my attention because it raised a caution flag that there's evidence that court decisions are starting to eat away at First Amendment protections like Times versus Sullivan. Eric, I'm not doing justice to your insight, so let me ask you to take it from there.
Well, as I'm sure Steve knows, it's not that New York Times versus Sullivan has been overturned, but there are some judges out there, most notoriously Justice Thomas, who wrote a scathing dissent a year and a half ago, saying New York Times was wrongly decided and was policy masquerading as legal opinion. And that raised a lot of concern among First Amendment lawyers. I know that a lot of First Amendment lawyers are very, very wary of any libel case, particularly ever getting to the Supreme Court, or at least this current Supreme Court. So I don't know if Steve has any opinions on that, thoughts about that. How important is New York Times versus Sullivan in actual malice? Is it in danger? That sort of thing.
Well, first of all, I think it's hugely important. And I don't perceive the danger you perceive. But then again, I'm not a law professor, and you're watching this stuff more closely than I am. I do know, for example, that Brett Kavanaugh has a very strong record on the First Amendment. I also know that Clarence is old and he doesn't have a very good diet and he smokes a lot. So I'm, yeah, I mean, that was a crazy, dissent or concurrence. I forget which it was that he wrote, but that alone is not really a signal to me that that part of the First Amendment's in jeopardy. And if anything, the Supreme Court and the courts of appeals have, as I said earlier, actually, strengthened, or some would say, hid behind the First Amendment when it comes to other issues, such as regulation of marketing of drugs and things like that.
Yeah, I actually don't disagree with that. I think the New York Times versus Sullivan is not really in danger, but First Amendment lawyers, in my experience, and I guess I'm one of them, tend to have the sky is falling attitude whenever a Supreme Court decision kind of rattles their cages.
Steve, we have a couple of questions from our colleagues at the iSchool. Ihsan Mohammadi, I think I see you on the second panel here. Can you share a question? There you are. Hi.
Hi. Thank you, Steve, for the great data that you provided for the NewsGuard. I have a question. I was in the middle of a study last summer to use the NewsGuard rating scale. And it was very useful, and it was accessible to the public for free, the scale from 1 to 100. But in the middle of that, it seems that you closed the free access. Is there any reason for that, or do you have any plan to help researchers? Because it helped us to just go in a large scale to implement the dissemination of less trusted information, that you put a lot of effort on that.
Well, I guess my glib answer is that the cashier at the out of the grocery store takes the same position with our employees that she takes with other employees, that they want to get paid, and therefore our people have to get paid. We've invested now over $13 million in those ratings. We license them at a very low fee to nonprofit institutions that are doing research, and we probably have 20 different universities in the U.S. that have a license to use our data as long as they cite it in their research, as long as they cite it appropriately. The browser extension, which you're referring to, we originally created it just as a sample to show licensees like Microsoft, for example, how NewsGuard works and how it would work if you put it on your browser. Microsoft has a browser, and then it turned out that librarians heard about it and wanted to use it. And we figured, well, this is a great thing, that we can do on a pro bono basis, which we still do, which is if it's a public library, they can download the browser extension for free. If you want to get the browser extension for free, Microsoft has paid us to make it available on Edge, which is their browser, for free. If you want it from the others, there is a $2.95 a month charge, but that's not really our main business. We just do that so that we can monetize it, but it's hardly the main aspect of our business. Our big business is licensees like Microsoft or British Telecom, or in the case of BrandGuard, major ad agencies. Yeah, we charge for it and we think it's valuable.
We have another question from the iSchool, Faley 2. I believe in health information for all, and accessing credible health information is a human right. Could you talk about how to support public libraries to promote the access to credible health news?
Well, one of our sub-products from NewsGuard is a product called HealthGuard, which does exactly that, which is it covers, and this is included in NewsGuard, it covers all sites that have any kind of health care information or misinformation on them. So that became particularly relevant during the pandemic. So we're already doing that.
So in this conversation, I think we have to wrestle with the big social media platforms. Stop the Steal, which led to the insurrection, started as a Facebook group. Facebook, it's not a NewsGuard client. They have their preferred fact checkers, but as a society, we're having a debate on policy. Should we break them up? Should we make them jump through hoops? Should we repeal Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act? What are your insights on how do we get our hands around the massive problem of disinformation, misinformation on social media platforms that have so many members and users?
Sure. Let's start with two premises. One is that the good news about the internet is that anyone can be a publisher, and the bad news about the internet is that anyone can be a publisher. And the second premise we should bear in mind is that Facebook's business model is to have that kind of misinformation, the sensational stuff, the hoax stuff, be there because that's what keeps people on. That's what keeps a certain percentage of people glued to Facebook, and that's how they make money. So if you start with those two premises, then I think the third thing you should think about is, at least what I think about is, I don't want the government controlling content. That's just a line we should not cross. So then where does that take you? I don't think the antitrust laws have anything to do with this because, again, if that's Facebook's business model, if you broke Facebook up into 6 Facebooks, that would be 6 business models, and it wouldn't do anything. What I think we should do is change Section 230. What 230 basically did was allowed one industry, the tech industry, to have complete impunity from the common law, from from causing harm. If you're a chemical company or an automobile company, there are certain things you can and can't do, depending on whether it harms everybody else. If you're a tech platform, none of that applies. And when you tell an industry that you don't have to be responsible for anything, guess what? They create a business model that's responsible for nothing, except for driving eyeballs. It's the only business that has that model. So what I would do is I change Section 230 only in the following way, which is you have to earn that immunity by demonstrating that you're exercising due care, that you're giving your users the tools to have a safer experience on your platform. And those tools would be, middleware tools. So you could buy, so Facebook could offer you a tool to protect you from pornography, to protect you from, gambling sites, or to protect you from misinformation and disinformation. And they would supply those tools. They license them from us and from other providers. And that would demonstrate that you're designing your product with due care in mind. Most products are designed in some way with safety in mind. The government stepped in a long time ago and made the automobile industry design their products with safety in mind. The issue here is you don't want the government stepping in and ruling on content, but the government can step in and say, that impunity we gave you that no other industry has, well, you can keep it if you use it responsibly. And if you don't use it responsibly, you lose your safe harbor.
Well, it seems to me, wrestling with this issue in classes here, that a key issue is the moment these platforms' algorithms promote a piece of content, what you're suggesting, makes them publishers. The Facebook, as you've probably read, the Facebook's own data, which says that 64% of people who join radical groups on Facebook joined those groups after they were recommended by.
Well, they are publishers. They are publishers, but
to me, that once you say that, you're a publisher, and you're not the same as the newspaper. I got that, but I'm not sure you can hide behind we're just a conduit. We're just a tech platform.
well, they've certainly done it successfully. And remember, Section 230 says that they're not responsible for user content.
Right.
So you'd have a hard time going to court and saying, well, since your algorithm arranges that user content in some way, Section 230 is invalid. You might win, you might lose. The better way to do that is to say, you have that immunity, but you have to do something to earn it, which, by the way, is exactly what is happening in the United Kingdom. They're about to pass legislation that pretty much says exactly that, and the EU is going to follow.
So one thing that we sometimes talk about here as we look at the problems facing not just news organizations, but also libraries, both are in a period of reinventing themselves. How could news organizations and libraries better work together to serve the information and journalistic needs of a community?
Well, I always thought, and we tried to do this, and then the pandemic happened. But for example, there's no reason why your local newspaper couldn't run news literacy programs with the library system. It's certainly in their interest to distinguish themselves from all the other garbage that may be online that purports to cover your region, and it's certainly in the library's interest. And we've run a couple of programs like that in other places, but that's certainly one thing. And I think libraries, a lot of libraries have really stepped up when it comes to providing broadband access, which I guess a lot of us, except those of us who are involved in libraries, would be surprised to know is a key source of broadband access for a significant chunk of the population. So I think that's the hook to do that.
Well, there's to me, a broad sort of overarching issue here. And that is, are we at a point, because of the tailspin that you described so well, where people no longer want factual news? They just want to hear what they like. And you look at the success of Fox News, and particularly their primetime lineup, which...
Or MSNBC.
Yeah, I think that there may be a few more facts on MS, but yes, you could say the same.
Well, here's the story I tell about that, which is I'm a New York Yankees fan.
Right.
And when the Yankees win, if the Yankees are winning, I'll watch every minute of the game.
Right.
If they do win, I'll then watch all the 11 o'clock news reports about how they won, even though I just watched the game. And then I'll read all the New York newspaper accounts of how they won, even though I watched the game and I watched the 11 o'clock news. If the Yankees are losing, I turn the set off. Then I'll sort of sneak back on in the seventh inning. If they're still losing, I'll turn it off for good because I don't want to hear about it. I won't read about it. I won't watch any accounts of it. Now, that's okay for a baseball fan, but that's really a problem, for, citizens, worrying about what's going on in their democracy. And but it is a natural instinct, and technology has basically tapped into that instinct by sending you stuff you're going to like, that you're going to agree with. Yeah. So I sentence myself every night to watch a certain number of minutes of Fox News just because I don't agree with it. And I want to see what other people are seeing. And I read, conservative sites or, sites that I might not agree with just to make sure I'm hearing the argument. But you're right. That is a practice that has just gone away. And, I'll take you back to what I said before, which is when when the broadcast networks in the 1960s and 70s had 91% of all the eyeballs, with the rest watching, PBS and maybe a local news channel, but they had 91% of all the eyeballs. So there were basically three people who made a decision about what news you were going to see. Well, that had its own problems, right? That's much too much concentration of power, but at least we all saw the same news. Now it is a total bubble between what you are likely to see on Fox and likely to see on MSNBC, to take the two prime examples, let alone what you're likely to see on your favorite website. If your favorite website is the American Thinker, which is a NewsGuard Red rated site that is just got a bunch of wild stuff in it. Or if you're reading still about the advantages of hydroxychloroquine and how dangerous masks are. It's too
So we
different.
just have a few minutes left. Let me ask you some just rapid fire questions. Are the media giving too much coverage to Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Yes and no. I mean, that's like asking me, do I rubberneck at a car accident?
Yeah.
Right? We all do.
It's hard not to do.
We all do.
AP fires an intern. The reasons are somewhat opaque, but apparently it's related to her social media posts. She does it about the Middle East, and she works domestically. Are we being too tough on a kid just out of school?
No.
Okay.
AP has a cherished brand, more than most, that is respected around the world for not taking sides.
Both sidesism. We live in a Republican state, and when I talk to people here, there's a sense that if you're covering somebody criticizing Trump, you should be covering somebody criticizing Maxine Waters. False equivalency, or is that part of maintaining a perception of fairness?
Well, I think it's part of maintaining fairness, not a perception of fairness. But, I don't know that it's false equivalency or not. Obviously, Trump, at least when he was president, was more important to cover than Maxine Waters. But I thought Maxine Waters, should have been censored for what she said about, urging, protesters to confront people more. Now, that's the same as Marjorie Taylor Greene. There are degrees of offenses in the world, but I thought that was wrong, and I thought that should have been covered.
So a final question for me: what role should the academy, should a college that includes journalism and information studies and libraries in the community, what role should we play in addressing these problems and issues?
Just what I'm going to say is obvious and trite, but just do what you're doing, which is encourage people to focus on the quality of the work they do and the integrity of it.
So news literacy, to get out of the tailspin, seemingly that has to be one of the things that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, although it's news literacy, but before you get to literacy,
it's not just
leaders have to emerge in this country, and you can say that President Biden is attempting this. Have to emerge in this country that make the case to people that we're not all enemies.
Excellent. Well, I have a TV background, so I'm accustomed to getting off on time. So, Steve, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And to those of you who were with us and shared your questions, thank you for your contributions. Tom?
Yeah. Hey, I want to thank everybody for their attendance today. Thank you so much. Steve, we were going to, again, Steve and I were talking about this earlier. He was invited down to visit with us in person last spring and was going to be with us last April, I believe. Obviously, that was put on hold. So, Steve, you have an open invitation as soon as you feel like traveling again to come down and visit us in person. Would love to have you.
I'll take you up on that.
Okay, great.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for your insight. I want to thank you for your time as well. Just some excellent information there. Everyone else, look for an announcement soon. We'll have some more speakers this summer. We should confirm Brad Smith, Microsoft president, co-author of the new book, Tools and Weapons, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, will be joining us. So stay tuned for more details. And again, Steve, thanks a lot. Thanks to everybody else. Good to see you.